I woke up to a stranger standing at the foot of my bed. I jolted awake, my body rigid with fear. The dim glow of the streetlight filtered through my blinds, casting long shadows across my bedroom. But one shadow stood out. A figure stood at the foot of my bed. I tried to scream, but my throat clenched shut. My pulse pounded in my ears as I strained to make out the details of the intruder. Was this a dream? Sleep paralysis? Or was someone really in my room? The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. "Who are you?" I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers trembling. But before I could grab it, the figure stepped closer. A woman. She was pale, her dark hair hanging in damp strands around her face. Her eyes, wide, glassy, and filled with something I couldn't quite name, bore into mine. She wore a dress, old-fashioned, torn at the hem. "You're in my house," she finally said, her voice hollow. A chill swept through me. My house? Number, I had lived here for 3 years, alone. You're mistaken," I stammered. "This is my home." She took another step forward. The air grew thick, heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. "This was my home first," she whispered. I scrambled backward, pressing myself against the headboard. My mind raced. A break-in? A ghost? A hallucination? "You need to leave," I said, forcing my voice to sound firm. A flicker of sadness crossed her face. Then, she lifted a hand and pointed toward the far wall. I turned my head, following her gaze, and I saw it. The wallpaper near the corner of the room was peeling. That was normal. I had always meant to fix it. But now, in the faint glow of the streetlight, I saw something beneath it. A patch of wood, different from the rest of the wall. A door. A door I had never noticed before. I turned back to the woman, my breath catching in my throat. She was gone. I sat frozen for what felt like minutes, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Then, slowly, I climbed out of bed, my feet unsteady against the cold floor. I stepped toward the wall. Hesitant, I reached out and pulled at the peeling wallpaper. It gave way easily, crumbling beneath my fingers. The door was real. Old, with a rusted handle. Something in my gut screamed at me not to open it. But I did. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. A smell hit me then. Damp earth, dust, and something else. Something rotten. And then I heard it. A whisper. Not from behind me, from below. The voice was the same as the woman's. But this time it said something different. "You let him out." My breath hitched. A gust of air rushed past me as if something unseen had just run up the stairs. The door slammed shut. And I wasn't alone anymore. The air in the room thickened, pressing against me like a weight. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle, desperate to pry it open again. But it wouldn't budge. Then, a creak. Not from the door. From behind me. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. The shadows in the room had deepened, swallowing the familiar shapes of my furniture. But in the center of the darkness stood a figure. Not the woman. Something taller. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side as if its neck was broken. I couldn't see its face. Just the vague outline of something wrong. 2 long limbs, fingers that twitched as if testing their own existence. I swallowed hard, my breath coming in short gasps. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. A low, rasping breath filled the silence. And then, "She shouldn't have spoken to you." The voice was deep, guttural, like it was crawling through something thick to reach me. My legs threatened to give out beneath me. My mind screamed at me to wake up, that this had to be a nightmare. Then it moved. Not like a person, more like a flicker, a distortion, there 1 second and closer the next. I stumbled backward, slamming against the wall. My fingers scrambled for my phone again, for anything I could use as a weapon, but my limbs felt sluggish, heavy. It took another step. And then, the door behind me wrenched open on its own. A gust of icy air swept through the room, nearly knocking me off my feet. The figure flinched, its form flickering like static. Then, from the darkness of the hidden staircase, the woman's voice rang out again. "Run." I didn't hesitate. I bolted from the room, my feet barely touching the floor as I hurtled down the hallway. Behind me, I heard something scrape against the walls, a sound like nails dragging through wood. I threw myself down the stairs, nearly tripping in my panic. I reached the front door, fumbling with the lock, my fingers numb and clumsy. Just as I yanked it open, I risked one last glance behind me. The figure stood at the top of the stairs, unmoving now, watching. Its head slowly tilted the other way, as if considering me. And then the door to my room, the hidden door, slammed shut. The woman was gone. And so was it. I ran into the night, gasping for air. My house loomed behind me, silent, still, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I never went back inside. 2 days later, the house burned down. The fire department never found the cause. But I think I know. Because as I stood across the street watching the flames consume the place I had once called home, I swore I saw something in the upstairs window. Not the woman. Him. And he was still watching me. The fire should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. For days after my house burned down, I stayed at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, trying to convince myself that what had happened wasn't real. I told myself it had been a stress-induced hallucination, a sleep-deprived nightmare. But deep down, I knew the truth. Because he was still watching me. It started small. Shadows in places where they shouldn't be. The feeling of being watched even when I was alone. My reflection in the motel mirror lingering half a second too long when I turned away. And then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks of the motel's thin walls. But the voice was familiar. Her voice. The woman from my bedroom. The one who had warned me to run. "He's not done with you." I tried to ignore it. I really did. But then, the dreams started. Each night, I found myself back in my burned-down house, standing before that hidden door. It was always slightly open, blackness stretching beyond it like an open mouth. In my dreams, I knew that if I stepped inside, I wouldn't come back out. But something inside the darkness always called to me. One night, I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. My motel room was silent except for the soft hum of the heater. I reached for my phone, trying to ground myself, when I noticed something. The closet door was open. I never left it open. My pulse spiked as I sat up, peering into the darkness. My fingers trembled as I reached for the lamp. The second the light flicked on, I saw it. Footprints. Ashy, blackened footprints leading from the closet to the foot of my bed. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. By the third night, I knew I had to go back. Not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. The house was nothing but charred ruins when I returned. Yellow caution tape flapped in the cold wind, but no one was around to stop me. I stepped over the remains of my front door and made my way upstairs. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and something else. Something rotten. My bedroom was almost unrecognizable, the walls scorched black. But as I stood there, heart pounding, I saw something impossible. The hidden door. Untouched. The fire had destroyed everything except that door. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I didn't want to open it. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around and leave. But I was done running. With shaking hands, I reached for the handle. It was ice cold. I twisted it and the door swung open with a soft creak. The staircase was still there, still leading down into the darkness. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air was damp, thick with decay. My feet barely made a sound as I descended, my phone's flashlight casting long, flickering shadows along the walls. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small stone chamber. Old, ancient, like it had been hidden beneath the house for centuries. And in the center of the room stood a chair. No, a throne. Made of old, rotting wood, covered in deep scratches like something had tried to claw its way free. And sitting in it? Him. His head snapped up, and for the first time, I saw his face. Or what was left of it. Hollow sockets where eyes should have been. A mouth stretched into an eternal grin, jagged and blackened, as if burned into his flesh. He stood, and the entire room seemed to breathe. You came back. The door behind me slammed shut, and the last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me whole was the woman's voice. I told you to run. Darkness swallowed me whole. The air was thick, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Then, a whisper right against my ear. You shouldn't have come back. I jerked forward, gasping for air, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. My phone flickered weakly in my hand, its light barely illuminating the cold stone walls around me. The throne was empty, but I knew I wasn't alone. A faint shuffling echoed in the distance, slow and deliberate. Something was watching me. I turned in circles, my flashlight casting eerie, jagged shadows across the damp stone floor. And then, a breath, hot and rancid, brushed the back of my neck. I spun around. Nothing. The throne loomed in the center of the room, its wood blackened and splintered. The scratches on its surface seemed deeper now, almost like words. My fingers brushed over them, and an icy sensation shot up my arm. The markings weren't random. They were letters. A name. Jonah. A shiver ran down my spine. Then, movement. A shadow detached itself from the far wall, unfolding like something breaking free from a cocoon. The air grew thick with the scent of burning wood and decay. And then, he stepped forward. Jonah. His face, twisted and inhuman, was wrong in ways my mind couldn't fully comprehend. His eyes were nothing but empty sockets, black as the void that surrounded us. His grin stretched far too wide, burned into his face as though seared by fire. I stumbled back. You're not real, I whispered, trying to force the words into existence. He took a step closer. I was real enough to burn your house down. A choking fear clawed at my throat. I had to get out. I turned, yanking at the door behind me, but it wouldn't budge. The cold seeped into my bones, a deep, consuming numbness that made every movement sluggish. Jonah was closer now. His grin never wavered, but I felt his amusement. You let me out. I shook my head violently. Number, I didn't. I don't even know what you are. He tilted his head. Don't you? A flash of something seared through my mind. Memories that weren't mine. A family. Laughter. A home built over something that should have stayed buried. A boy. Trapped beneath the floorboards, screaming for help. Fire. And then silence. I staggered backward, horror washing over me. You were... My voice failed. You were sealed away. His grin stretched wider. And you opened the door. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. The woman's voice. Her voice was somewhere in the chaos. Close it. Close it now. But it was too late. Jonah reached for me, and the world shattered. I woke up gasping for air. I wasn't in the basement anymore. I was... my motel room. The sun streamed through the thin curtains, painting golden lines across the floor. My clothes were damp with sweat, my hands trembling violently. Had it been a dream? Number. Because when I sat up, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen was cracked. The last picture in my camera roll, taken at 3:12 a.m., was a blurry shot of an open door. And a figure standing in the darkness beyond it. Watching me. My heart hammered in my chest. I stumbled out of bed, yanking the curtains open. The world outside was normal. People walked by, cars rumbled along the road. But then, as I turned to the motel mirror, something was wrong. My reflection wasn't moving. It just stood there, smiling. And in the reflection behind me, the closet door was open. My reflection didn't move. I froze, my heart thundering in my chest as I stared at myself in the mirror. My hands felt clammy, my mind a blur of terror. The air in the room grew heavier with every passing second, thick with the feeling that something was wrong, that something unseen was just out of reach. The figure in the mirror remained still, staring back at me with that same twisted grin I had seen in the basement, that same hollow, empty smile. I turned slowly, dread coiling in my stomach. The closet door was ajar. I hadn't opened it. I hadn't even noticed it before. For a moment, everything around me seemed to blur, the sounds of the outside world fading into a low hum as my pulse hammered in my ears. Slowly, I took a step toward the closet, my legs unsteady. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to escape, to do anything but face whatever lay beyond that door. But my feet were already moving. I reached the closet. The door creaked open under my hand. The darkness inside seemed to swallow the light, as though the room itself had deepened, stretching impossibly far. There was something inside, a coldness that seeped into the room, like it was pulling the very warmth from the air. And then, I saw it. The faintest glimmer in the corner of the closet, something reflective, catching the edge of the light. A piece of glass. I leaned in closer, my breath coming faster now. My fingers brushed the object, and I gasped as I pulled it out. It was a small, cracked mirror. But it wasn't mine. The reflection in the glass was wrong. I saw myself, but the reflection was different. Distorted. My eyes were wide, panicked, but the figure in the reflection stood still, grinning. And then, it moved. The reflection of me in the mirror took a step forward, its grin widening impossibly, its eyes filling with something dark and hungry. I staggered back, dropping the mirror. It shattered on the floor, but the shards didn't fall to the ground. They floated. My breath hitched. The shards hovered in the air, spinning slowly, the reflection of me still smiling, staring from within the fragments. A cold hand gripped my shoulder. I spun around, my heart nearly stopping in my chest. Behind me, standing in the doorway, was Jonah. His hollow eyes locked with mine. "You opened the door." His voice was a rasp, deep and malevolent. His grin grew wider, stretching too far. His skin stretched and warped, and with every movement he made, the room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, the air thickening. I stumbled back, my chest tight with panic. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could hear was the echo of that grin, that voice, the whispering presence that filled the room. "You can't escape." Jonah's words were like nails scraping across a chalkboard. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. And then, the figure behind him stepped forward. It was her. The woman. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and glassy. But now, in the mirror's reflection, I could see it clearly. She was the same as Jonah. Her smile stretched, jagged and wrong, her eyes hollow. She was trapped, just like him. "We are all here because of you," she whispered, her voice like 1,000 whispers at once, echoing around me. The air turned colder. The floor seemed to pulse beneath my feet. And then, it happened. The shadows from the corners of the room began to move, like living things. They swarmed toward me. Jonah's grin widened, his body flickering between the real world and the reflection in the shards of glass. The woman's figure merged with him, both of them coming together, forming into something larger, darker. "You opened the door," they both whispered together. "And now we're free." I couldn't breathe. I could feel their presence closing in, the weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating me. The shadows reached out, wrapping around me, pulling me toward the center of the room. I fought to move, but my limbs were heavy, my body trembling with a coldness that burned from the inside out. I reached for anything to hold on to, but the shadows were everywhere now. And then, everything stopped. The room fell silent, the shadows withdrew, the weight lifted. I opened my eyes, disoriented, my chest heaving with exhaustion. I was no longer in the motel room. I was back in my house. It was whole again, untouched by the fire. The walls were pristine, the furniture arranged just as it had been when I first moved in. But the door, the hidden door, stood open at the end of the hallway. And from beyond it, I heard the sound of whispering. "Come closer." I stood frozen, staring down the dark hallway toward that door. It was no longer just a doorway to a hidden room. It was a gateway, a way out. A place where they waited for me to return, to finish what I had started. But this time, I wasn't sure if I would ever leave. 40 Minnie. You said, "Continue the story." ChatGPT said, "ChatGPT, I woke up to a stranger standing at the foot of my bed." Part 6. I stood at the threshold of the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, as if the very house was alive, watching me. The hidden door at the end of the hall beckoned me, its blackness pulling at me like an open mouth. Behind it, the whispers continued, low and insistent, urging me to come closer. "It's time." The words echoed in my mind, a taunt, a command. I couldn't move at first, my feet rooted to the floor as though the house itself had a hold on me, unwilling to let me go. But then the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I knew there was no escaping it now. I had to face whatever was beyond that door. I took a step forward, then another. The house creaked around me, the old wood groaning under my weight, but there was no sound, no human sound at all. Just the wind outside, the oppressive silence inside, and the distant rustle of those whispers. With every step, the air grew colder. The shadows stretched longer, twisting around the edges of the walls like dark fingers reaching for me. The door seemed farther away than it should have been, as if the hall was stretching, pulling me deeper into its grasp. I reached for the handle. It was cool to the touch, slick with condensation, as if the house was sweating, trying to warn me away. But I didn't stop. With a deep breath, I twisted the handle and pushed the door open. It swung inward with a groan, revealing the basement that had once been hidden from view. But this time, it was different. The stairs that had once led down to that cold, damp room now stretched farther into the shadows, disappearing into a thick, swirling blackness that seemed to pulse with something alive. "Come down." The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was everywhere, surrounding me, wrapping itself around my thoughts, pushing me forward. And I couldn't stop. I couldn't turn away. My feet moved on their own, as if controlled by something else. I descended into the darkness step by trembling step. The air was thick with decay. A musty, rotting scent clung to the walls, and the farther I went, the more I could taste the dust, the mold, the centuries of filth that had accumulated in this place. I could feel something in the darkness, watching me, waiting. When I reached the bottom, the room was completely dark, the shadows swallowing everything around me. The only sound was the beating of my own heart in my chest, loud and erratic. Suddenly, a flicker of light illuminated the room. It was the woman. The same woman from before. Her pale face lit by a single flickering candle. She stood at the far end of the room, her eyes wide and glassy, staring at me with a mixture of sorrow and something darker, something that almost felt like hunger. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice cold, like ice scraping across metal. I took a step back, but my feet wouldn't obey. The door at the top of the stairs slammed shut, the sound echoing like thunder in the small, suffocating space. The woman's lips curled into a smile, the same jagged, twisted grin I had seen in the mirror. It stretched impossibly wide, like it was breaking through her face. Her hands began to twitch, fingers bending at strange angles as she stepped closer, her movements jerky and unnatural. "You're not going to leave," she said, her voice a chorus of voices, all layered together, all speaking at once. "We've waited so long, and now we're free." I struggled to move, to scream, to do anything, but it was as if the room had turned to stone around me, holding me in place. Jonah's figure appeared from the shadows behind her, his empty eyes locking with mine. The grin on his face was even wider now, almost split in half. "It's too late," he said, his voice low and rasping. "You can't undo what's been done." The shadows behind them stirred, swirling like smoke taking form. Figures began to emerge. More faces, more eyes, all staring at me, their hollow, silent expressions watching me like I was the last piece of a puzzle. Some were distorted, like the woman in Jonah. Others had familiar faces twisted with terror, their bodies warped and disfigured. They had been here for so long, waiting, bound by something I had unleashed. And then, the floor beneath me began to crack. I looked down in horror as the stone cracked open, revealing an abyss. It was as if the entire house was collapsing, breaking open to reveal the void that had been waiting beneath it. The room trembled as if the earth itself was breaking apart. The shadows moved, the figures reaching for me, pulling at the edges of my mind, dragging me closer to the edge. I couldn't stop myself. The darkness, the weight, the pull. It was too much. My body was moving against my will, my feet carrying me toward the edge of the void, the shadowy figures whispering, chanting in voices I couldn't understand. The woman, Jonah, and the others were closing in, their hands outstretched, their eyes burning with a hungry glow. And then, I heard it. "It's not you we want." The voice was different this time. Calm, soothing. It came from behind me. I turned, my heart skipping a beat, and saw her again. The woman from the first night, the one who had warned me to run. She was standing in the doorway to the basement, her form barely visible in the shadows. But her eyes, her expression, she was not like the others. "You opened the door," she said, stepping forward, her voice soft but firm. "But you're not the one they were waiting for. You've been their vessel, their gateway." The shadows writhed, hissed. Jonah snarled, his form flickering as if he were struggling to remain. "Get away from him," the woman shouted, her voice sharp, cutting through the darkness. With a burst of strength I didn't know I had, I turned and ran. I ran back up the stairs, the basement shaking around me, the figures screaming, reaching for me. But they couldn't catch me. I slammed the door shut behind me. But the woman's face remained in my mind, her voice echoing in my ears. The door to the basement slammed shut behind me, but the house didn't quiet down. It was as if the walls were alive, shifting, groaning in protest. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, filling the space, circling me like a storm. The shadows were everywhere, creeping across the walls, stretching toward me like tendrils of darkness. I stumbled back down the hall, my legs weak, my breath ragged, but every step felt wrong, like the house itself was pushing against me. I reached for the front door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the doorknob. It wouldn't turn. I yanked harder, but the door refused to open, its surface cold and slick as if frozen shut by something far worse than the night outside. "Please," I whispered, pressing my palm against the door, feeling the thudding of my heartbeat in my chest. "Let me out." The shadows thickened, swirling around the edges of the room, blocking any light from the outside world. A low hum filled the air, rising from beneath the floorboards, vibrating through my bones. I felt it deep in my soul, a cold, suffocating energy that wrapped itself around my mind, pulling me back, urging me deeper into the house, into the shadows. "You are theirs now." The voice came from everywhere, the words like ice cracking through the air with a finality that made my skin crawl. I turned around, panic rising in my chest as I faced the hallway again. The walls seemed to close in on me, the space narrowing as if the house itself were trying to devour me. The basement door, though closed, seemed to pulse with a dark magnetic energy. I could hear the figures calling from below, their voices scraping at my sanity. And then something shifted. I blinked, and suddenly I wasn't in the house anymore. I stood in a vast, empty field under a sky churning with dark clouds. The wind whipped through the air, biting cold, but the landscape stretched on endlessly, desolate, barren, like the world had been abandoned. My feet sank into the ground, as though the earth itself was pulling me down, dragging me deeper into the dirt. And then I saw her. The woman, the one who had warned me, stood in the distance, her form hazy, almost like a mirage. Her face was faintly illuminated by an eerie light that seemed to come from nowhere. I could feel her presence, strong and quiet, like an anchor in this endless emptiness. "You didn't escape," she said, her voice carrying across the wind, soft yet sharp, like a blade cutting through the silence. "You only opened a door into a place far worse." I stepped toward her, my body heavy, reluctant to move, but compelled by something I couldn't explain. The ground beneath me seemed to shift with every step, the earth groaning as if it were alive. You were right," I said, my voice breaking. I opened the door. I thought I could stop it, but I can't. It's too much. I don't know how to fix it. I don't know what's real anymore. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked toward me, her steps slow, deliberate. When she was close enough, I saw the expression on her face. Soft, sorrowful, but laced with something that might have been pity. "It's not about fixing it," she said. "It's about accepting it. You can't undo what's been done. The house is only a doorway, but it leads somewhere else, somewhere darker. And Jonah is the keeper of it." I felt a chill at the mention of his name. Jonah. His twisted, empty grin, his hollow eyes. He had followed me, hunted me, and now he was here, waiting for me. Waiting for all of us. "But you don't have to go back," she continued. "You don't have to let them take you." I opened my mouth to speak, to ask how, but the words caught in my throat. My head spun, and the landscape around me blurred, as though reality itself was shifting, twisting like a twisted painting. Suddenly, I was no longer standing in the field. I was back in the house. The front door was still shut, the shadows pressing in around me. But now, something else was there. Jonah. He stood in the center of the room, his form more solid now, his grin stretched wide. The woman was nowhere to be seen. There was only him and the oppressive darkness he brought with him. "You thought you could escape," Jonah's voice rasped, the sound scraping against my bones. "But you belong here now. This is where you've always been meant to be." I backed away, terror clawing at my throat. No, I won't let you." "It's too late." Jonah lunged forward, his movement almost a blur, and everything around me went black. When I woke, I wasn't sure how much time had passed. I was lying on a cold, hard floor, the air thick with the smell of smoke and something else. Something rotten. Slowly, I pushed myself up, feeling the weight of exhaustion in my limbs. My vision swam, and as I stood, I realized I was no longer in my house. I was back in the basement. The shadows shifted in the corners, but there was no sign of Jonah or the woman. The only sound was the soft rustle of air and the pounding of my heart in my ears. I reached for my phone, my fingers numb. The screen was cracked, shattered in several places, but the image that appeared when I unlocked it made my blood run cold. It was a picture of me, standing at the foot of my bed, looking down at myself, as though I were still sleeping. And standing just behind me, with his hollow eyes and that twisted grin, was Jonah. The screen on my phone flickered, the image of Jonah lingering, his grotesque smile wide and knowing. I dropped it with a sharp gasp, my hands trembling. The phone hit the floor with a soft thud, but I didn't dare reach for it again. The realization sank in like ice in my veins. I wasn't just running from them anymore. I was part of the game. The basement around me hummed, low and unnatural, as if it were breathing. The shadows had thickened since the last time I was here, more alive now, pulsing with an energy I couldn't describe. I could feel them, not just watching, but waiting, as if they were drawn to me, bound by the same force that had brought me here in the first place. I moved cautiously toward the far corner of the room, where the light from the ceiling barely reached. The walls felt slick under my fingertips, as if they had been touched by countless hands before mine. I tried to steady my breath, but each inhalation felt like it might choke me. It was as if the house itself were drawing the very air from my lungs. In the corner, the broken mirror I had seen before, the one that had shown me the distorted version of myself, was leaning against the wall. Its shards gleamed in the dim light, still floating in midair, suspended like fragments of a broken reality. Before I could move closer, a voice broke through the thick silence. "You shouldn't have come back." It was her, the woman. Her voice, distant yet clear, cut through the oppressive air like a blade. I spun toward her, but she wasn't standing in the room with me. She was there, in the mirror. Her form flickered, distorted by the fractured glass, her eyes wide and pleading. The reflection was warped, but I knew it was her. "This place is not your home anymore," she whispered, her voice wavering, almost drowned out by the oppressive weight of the shadows. "It's already claimed you." I shook my head, my throat tight with fear. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. It was like something was forcing me to stay silent, to listen to the words that had been haunting me for so long. "You were the key," she continued, her words heavy with sorrow. "You opened the door, and now they won't let you leave. Jonah is their keeper, and once you've crossed the threshold, you belong to them." I stepped back, my heart racing. Jonah? The name echoed in my mind, a name tied to something darker than I had ever imagined. He was the one who had watched me, who had come after me not just as a stranger, but as a guardian of something ancient, something hungry. "There's no escape." Her voice cracked, and for a moment I saw something flicker in her reflection. Fear. "You opened the door, but it was never meant for you. You are the door now." The walls around me seemed to close in, and I felt a sickening pressure building in my chest, as if the house was trying to crush me under its weight. I turned toward the stairs, but before I could move, a sudden shudder ran through the floor. The shadows swirled violently, and the basement seemed to warp around me, shifting as if it were alive. A figure emerged from the darkness. Jonah. His eyes glowed with a malevolent hunger, his grin widening as he took a step toward me. He moved with unnatural speed, his body flickering between the shadow and the physical world, like some kind of twisted half-being. The air around him crackled with an energy that made my skin crawl. "You didn't listen," Jonah rasped, his voice a low growl. "You never listen. You thought you could escape this, but you can't. The door is open and you are mine now." I tried to run, my legs shaking as I turned to flee, but the shadows erupted around me, forming into tendrils that reached out, wrapping around my ankles, pulling me back toward him. I fought against them, my heart racing, but the more I struggled, the tighter they held me. Jonah's laugh filled the room, a twisted, empty sound that echoed off the walls, making the shadows writhe even more. "You opened the door," he said again, his voice cold, cruel. "You think you can shut it? You can never close it once it's open. And now you're part of it. Part of us." The shadows pulled me closer to him, and I screamed, a sound that felt foreign to my own ears. It was raw, desperate, filled with terror. But then, in the chaos of the moment, I heard her again. The woman. "You have a choice." Her voice was a whisper, but it cut through the darkness like a beacon of hope. "You can close the door." I blinked, my mind spinning. Close the door? The woman's reflection in the shattered mirror flickered again, her face twisted with both pain and determination. You can't leave through the door they want, but you can close it. You can end it. I turned my head toward the mirror. The broken shards on the floor, the pieces of glass. They weren't just reflections. They were windows. Windows to another reality. The air around me shifted and the shadows began to recede. Not from Jonah, but from me. I realized I was holding on to something. Something small. Something sharp. I looked down and saw a shard of glass clutched tightly in my hand. It was one of the broken pieces from the mirror. Jonah stepped forward, his smile widening, his eyes hungry. You can't stop it. You're already here. I raised the shard, my hands shaking, but my resolve firming. The woman's voice, distant but clear, urged me on. You can close it. With every ounce of strength I had left, I thrust the shard toward the shadows, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The moment it pierced the air, the room seemed to snap, the very fabric of reality trembling. The ground shook beneath me, the walls crackling as if the house itself were screaming. Jonah's form faltered, the shadows recoiling, retreating from the shard. No, he screamed, his voice unraveling, desperate. But it was too late. The mirror shattered. The shadows collapsed. The door slammed shut. And the house fell silent. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, feeling the weight lift from my chest. The oppressive feeling of being trapped, of being watched, of being owned. It was gone. But as I sat there in the stillness, the silence pressing in around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Waiting. It wasn't over. Not yet. I stood up slowly, and when I looked at the door that had once been open, I knew. I had closed it. But it wasn't gone. The house had merely paused. And when the time came, it would open again. The door would call. I stood there, frozen in the quiet aftermath, as the room around me settled into a deceptive calm. The shadows had receded, the whispers silenced, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe without the crushing weight of dread on my chest. The house was still. The door was closed. But there was a sensation, an itch at the back of my mind, a whisper of something unfinished, something waiting to awaken. I turned slowly, glancing over my shoulder toward the mirror that had once shown me a fractured reality. The glass was still broken, scattered in sharp shards across the floor. The room felt empty now, devoid of the shadows that had lurked at the edges of my vision. But that feeling of being watched, of being chosen, remained. You think it's over, a voice said, breaking through the silence. It was low, almost a hiss, curling around the edges of my thoughts. My heart skipped a beat. I knew that voice. Jonah. I spun around. But this time the room was different. The air was heavy, thick with the same sense of wrongness that had clung to me from the beginning. The walls seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat, and the shadows that had once receded now began to crawl back, inching toward me with terrifying slowness. But Jonah wasn't standing at the foot of the bed anymore. He was right behind me. I felt his cold breath against my neck, like ice on my skin. And I could hear it. The faint rustle of fabric, the soft shift of weight, the faintest click of a lock turning. The door had opened. You sealed it, Jonah murmured, his voice a low, guttural growl. But you never really closed it. Not for good. I could feel his presence now, suffocating me, wrapping itself around me like a vice. The room began to darken again, the edges of reality blurring, twisting. The shards of glass on the floor began to glow, faintly at first, then brighter, like the reflection of something that should never be seen. It's not over, he repeated, his voice echoing in the room, louder this time. Not by a long shot. I reached for the shard in my hand, my only defense, but the ground beneath me began to quake, the house shaking violently like it was alive and furious. The walls cracked, splitting apart with a sound like thunder. You've let it in, Jonah said, his voice distant now, as if coming from another realm entirely. You've let it back. And in that moment, I understood. The house wasn't just a structure, it was a prison. A prison that I had been foolish enough to try and escape, and now I had reopened it. And something worse had followed me out. The shadows exploded around me, twisting, pulling at my limbs, dragging me toward the center of the room. The walls seemed to scream as they cracked open, revealing a darkness deeper than I had ever known. The house was hungry. I struggled, but it was futile. The shadows overwhelmed me, closing in, swallowing my screams. The air grew thick with their suffocating presence, their cold fingers wrapping around my throat, my legs, my mind. And then, in the deafening silence that followed, I realized the door had never really closed. It had only waited. The last thing I heard before the darkness consumed me was Jonah's voice. One final whisper, dripping with cruel amusement. "Welcome home." And in that moment, I understood. The house had never wanted me to leave. It had always wanted me to stay.